so that their legacy will be exemplary. Guide them in the path you have created, inspiring them with the potency of your powerful presence. May they trust your laws of sowing and reaping, knowing that they will receive a bountiful harvest if they persevere. Keep them from underestimating the power of your great name. Amen.
Will you please join in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
1 minute for morning business, please.
Senator may proceed.
Today, our national public health and economic crisis continues without additional legislative action. Reports over the weekend indicate that the Senate Minority Leader believes that he can hold out for a massive, unwieldy bill that even includes unrelated policies, yet refuse to consider action where there is already consensus. The New York Times reported that the Speaker said, quote, believes she has the upper hand and does not intend to lose it, end of quote. The other side refuses to support even the relief measures where there is broad bipartisan agreement, such as providing additional funds for unemployment benefits, the Paycheck Protection Program, education, state and local governments, recovery checks, and hiring and employee retention incentives. This shows us where their priorities are: politics, not people. I yield the floor. That's a shame.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I'd hope that this week the Senate would be busy providing more coronavirus aid. Chairman and ranking members would be working overtime across the aisle to finalize another major pandemic relief package for the American people. After all, there are so many important ways in which American families need help and which Democrats say they see as big priorities, just like Republicans do. Priorities like continuing a federal add-on to unemployment insurance, more tools for schools to safely reopen, more access to testing and diagnostics, more resources to develop vaccines and treatments, a new round of checks to put cash in families' hands ASAP, another round of the hugely successful Paycheck Protection Program that small businesses have relied on, which was left out of the Democrats' proposal. All of these things and many more were in Senate Republicans' $1 trillion proposal for another coronavirus rescue package focused on kids, jobs, health care, and legal protections to help our country reopen. So I'd hoped the Senate would be spending this week turning a major agreement into law. But sadly for the country, sadly for struggling Americans, the Speaker of the House and the Senate Democratic leader decided we would not deliver any of that, none of it. For weeks, Speaker Pelosi and Democratic leader in the Senate stalled in backroom negotiations with the administration's team. For weeks. They held up important aid over non-COVID-related demands. They stayed true to their comments from very early on in the pandemic. This is the way they looked at it. They saw this pandemic as, quote, a tremendous opportunity to structure things to fit our vision. That was the House Democratic whip. Speaker Pelosi herself put it this way: this is an opportunity. Every crisis is. Working families call this pandemic a crisis. They call it a nightmare. But leading Democrats call it an opportunity. Just listen to some of their demands. These are the Democrats' demands that stood between all of this help and the Americans who need it. Here's one. Democrats say nobody gets another dime of relief unless state and local governments get about $1 trillion in extra money. Let me say that again. Democrats are saying nobody gets another dime of relief unless state and local governments get $1 trillion in extra money. Let's put a few facts on the table. Number one, state and local governments have only spent about one-fourth of the huge sums we sent them back in the springtime, $150 billion. Number two, the economists who calculated the likely COVID-related shortfalls for state and local governments have mostly produced estimates that are entire multiples less than what Democrats are demanding. Number three, in our HEALS Act, Republicans tried to give states and localities extra flexibility around the unspent funds they already have. Extra flexibility around the unspent funds they already have. In my state, for example, 94% of the money we sent them has not been spent. And we wanted to send huge sums to help with schools, which are one of the state's biggest expenses. Typically, in a state budget, the two biggest items are education and Medicaid. But forget all that. Democrats are demanding that we send state and local governments a colossal amount of money with no relationship to actual need, while they've only spent a quarter, 25%, of the money they've already gotten. Clearly, this isn't about COVID. Democrats think they smell an opening they have wanted for years to make Uncle Sam bail out decades of mismanagement and broken policies in places like New York, New Jersey, and California. And so they've decided that no working family anywhere in America can get another cent, not 1 cent, unless they get to create a $1 trillion slush fund for mismanaged states completely and totally out of proportion to pandemic needs. Here's another one of those far-left demands. Nobody gets another dime unless we indefinitely pay people more to stay home than to go back to work. Now, Mr. President, Republicans agree we ought to continue additional federal jobless benefits during this extraordinary time. Senate Republicans tried several times to stop them from expiring. The Democratic leader blocked us. Our view, which a majority of Americans share, is simply that it disincentivizes rehiring and reopening to pay people more to stay home. Statement of the obvious. It disincentivizes rehiring and reopening to pay people more to stay home. Plenty of Democrats said they saw the point and were happy to negotiate on this. Speaker Pelosi's on number two. The House Majority Leader said, quote, "It's not $600 or bust." That was the number two Democrat in the House. The senior senator from Maryland said, quote, "We certainly understand we don't want to have a higher benefit than what someone can make working." Oh no, but the Speaker and the Democratic leader overruled them. No deal, unless we pay people more to stay home. That's not about COVID. It's not about a real reopening. It's about far-left ideology. They preferred for the jobless benefits to go down to zero, unless they could pay people more to stay home. Does anyone in this country really believe that relief for Americans should be totally contingent on bailing out states for mismanagement that predated the pandemic by decades? Does anyone really think it was better for jobless benefits to completely expire unless we pay people more not to work? And does anyone really think that Congress should walk away from countless subjects where a bipartisan agreement should be possible over these fringe positions? Do Americans think Democrats should walk away from school funding, testing, cash to households, preventing a spike in seniors' Medicare premiums, legal reform, and more over this? I think almost every family in America would answer these questions the same way. But unfortunately, Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic leader have answered them the opposite way. They think they have political leverage over the President of the United States, and so they're willing to personally increase the pain for vulnerable families unless they get their way on matters not related to COVID. Republicans wanted to agree on the things we could agree to. Democrats said, our way or the highway. Republicans wanted to send cash now, right now, for schools, testing, and unemployment benefits, and argue over state bailouts later. Democrats said nobody gets a penny unless Texas and Florida bail out New Jersey. That's their position. Nobody gets a penny unless Texas and Florida bail out New Jersey. So this is where we are. The previous UI benefits expired. The PPP closed its doors. Over the weekend, President Trump took steps to soften the blow of the Democrats' hostage tactics on American families who need help most. His decisions will help spare some Americans some of the pain from the Democrats' hostage taking. From the beginning, from the very beginning, Mr. President, our side has tried everything possible to find common ground and deliver more help. But the Democrats have said no. At least the American people know the score. At least they know the score. Now, on a totally different matter, this weekend brought more unsettling news in the ongoing struggle for Hong Kong to preserve any shred of its civil liberties and self-governance. One of the region's most prominent pro-democracy advocates, Jimmy Lai, was arrested yesterday for alleged violations of the so-called national security law imposed by Beijing. Last year, after an historic election that saw millions flock to the polls to overwhelmingly reject President Xi's preferred candidates, the Chinese Communist Party moved quickly to choke Hong Kongers' free expression. Mr. Lai has been at the vanguard of the vibrant Hong Kong-based media and publishing world. He's devoted much of his life to advancing precisely the sort of values that the CCP finds most repulsive: the freedom of thought and freedom of speech. The Senate, the country, and freedom-loving nations across the world stand with Mr. Lai and with all the peaceful demonstrators who've met the business end of the CCP's repression.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved, and under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
I suggest absent quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Democratic leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, over the weekend, the United States achieved an ignominious milestone. 5 million Americans are confirmed to have contracted COVID-19, by far the most in the world. Our country went from 4 million Americans having had the disease to 5 million in 17 days, only 17 days. 1 million Americans were infected in just 17 days. We've lost American businesses, American wealth, and an unbearable number of American lives, a number that will inevitably increase as the number of infections continues to rise. The brutal economic effect of the pandemic has spared no corner of our country. We're living through the greatest economic crisis since the Depression and the greatest health crisis since the Spanish flu in 1918. So it should not be hard to convince Republicans in the Senate and the White House to provide urgent and necessary relief to the American people. The $3.4 million in the HEROES Act was based on the country's needs, which are so large and so diverse. It's not a political position. It's what our country needs. Its schools, its businesses, its renters, its homeowners, its essential workers, its post office, its elections, state and local governments, our health care system. Leader McConnell doesn't seem to understand this. He sees everything through a political lens. But we Democrats are looking at the real needs of people, and they're large. They're in many different places. And that is why we called for a large bill, because it was needed, because the American people demanded it. And at this point, the American people are on our side. 2/3 by survey data support the $3.4 billion Democratic plan, not the skimpy Republican plan that doesn't deal with people's needs. But at the end of last week, after days of arduous negotiations, Speaker Pelosi and I continued to run into Republican intransigence. They didn't see people's needs the way we did. They didn't see the depth and breadth of this crisis. So, like in any normal negotiation, we offered to move in their direction if they would move in ours. Let's meet in the middle, we said. In the middle. That's how negotiations occur. That's how you get something done. The White House said no. It was difficult for us to offer that compromise. The Democratic position is that we want to devote enough resources to defeat the virus and see the American people through this crisis. The Republican position is to give much less than what's needed. Democrats don't want to leave large portions of the country and the economy to fend for itself. But the reason we want to meet in the middle is that getting major legislation through Congress is the only way to achieve something significant for the American people. Rather than compromise, our Republican counterparts said, take a hike. Quite literally, they said virtually this in the room: no, it's going to be our way or no way. We're not going to meet you in the middle. Why? Why wouldn't they? When the needs are so great, when there are so many people suffering and so many more who will suffer if we don't act. Well, it's because this Republican Party is tied in so tied in a knot that it can't agree to anything. It can only spew the same political speech every day. The Republican leader McConnell has admitted that 20 Republican senators won't vote for any more relief for the American people. The Senate bill that the leader keeps referring to, the Republican leader, lacks the support of Senate Republicans. He can't bring it to the floor because so many of them will vote against it. The president himself called the Republican bill semi-irrelevant, one of the few things that had some truth to it that he said about this crisis. It was not some possibility that Democrats blocked. Senate Republicans spiked it the moment it came out. Why? Maybe they thought that these executive orders would be a way out, so tied in a knot they can't legislate, or even bring themselves to join us to meet in the middle. They were clinging to the hope that the president could do something on his own through executive orders. But as we have seen, executive orders in general aren't going to get the job done, especially the incompetent ones issued over the weekend. President Trump's recent executive orders are so unserious in terms of meeting the large needs of America as to be pathetic. Take, for example, the payroll tax deferral. It makes no sense. Even Republican members of Congress, and according to reports, some members of the administration, opposed a payroll tax deferral because it would do next to nothing to help our workers or the economy. Remember, the president did not cancel payroll taxes. He can't. He just deferred them. Most employers will continue to withhold the payroll tax so that their employees won't be hit with a very large tax bill in December when the deferral expires. And ADP, a non-political payroll processing company, said, quote, "It may take months to implement the president's new policy." It feels like forever ago, but candidate Trump promised he was different from Republicans and would never touch Social Security or Medicare. Well, guess what? Deferring the payroll tax is a backdoor way of weakening Social Security and Medicare. In case the president's intentions weren't clear, he said that after the election he may permanently cut the payroll tax, which would deplete the trust funds and destroy Social Security and Medicare as we know it. If you're a senior or have paid into Social Security or Medicare and are waiting for it, watch out. Watch out. Seniors throughout the decades since we've had Social Security have jealously regarded the trust fund. And now Donald Trump says, well, maybe we should get rid of it because we should defer, we should get rid of the payroll tax altogether. So this executive order is an example of many false promises that Donald Trump has made. And just as importantly, it is so put together with spit and glue that in all likelihood, many states won't implement it at all. Some have said so. And many more, even if they want to implement it, will take months, several months, while people will not get their unemployment benefits. The easiest thing to do for the good of the economy, for keeping millions out of poverty, which the president's pandemic unemployment insurance has done, is simply to renew the existing unemployment insurance. But because of the hard right, because so many Republicans don't want to spend the money, even for people who have lost jobs through no fault of their own, doesn't happen. And the idea that the American worker is looking for an out is demeaning to the American worker, Leader McConnell. Americans want to work. There's pride in work. The overwhelming majority of Americans, if given the choice of a job or unemployment insurance for a period of time, even if that unemployment insurance is not exactly what they got paid, will take the job. We know that. America believes in the work ethic. So how demeaning to the American worker to say they're looking for a way out. They're looking for a way to skeeve the system. That's not the American worker I know. That's not the New York worker I know. But of course, when unemployment is over 10%, you can be looking for a job, but you may not get one. That's the reason so many people are on pandemic unemployment insurance. So the president's plan there was nothing short of a disaster in terms of its inability to be implemented, its effect on Social Security and Medicare, and the demeaning way in which it looks at the American worker. The president's executive order therefore, are a disaster. And the President's executive order on evictions is the best example of all sizzle and no steak. It does not even guarantee a moratorium on evictions. It merely instructs federal agencies to, quote, review and consider whether it's appropriate to halt evictions, let alone people who have fallen behind on their rent. So the three of the things the President has done don't work. The deferral of the payroll tax hurts Social Security and does not pump money into the economy. Cutting the employment insurance will take weeks and months to implement and hurts American workers and demeans them. And the executive order on evictions is, let's consider something. Well, we know what that means in jargon around here. Let's not do it. Let's just talk about it. So President Trump's executive orders are hardly worth the paper they're printed on. You don't have to take my word for it. Go ask Republican senators from South Carolina and Nebraska who aren't too thrilled with it either. And of course, the biggest problem with these executive orders is not what they do, but what they don't and can't do. The orders don't address testing, tracing, and treatment of COVID-19, desperately needed to curb the health crisis, which in turn is hurting the economy so badly. The order leaves out money to safely reopen our schools and provide the PPE and other help to keep kids, teachers, and staff safe. The orders won't give food assistance to hungry kids and families. The orders won't aid state and local governments, firefighters, sanitation workers, bus drivers, healthcare workers. All the people who keep our communities running could lose their jobs. The orders leave out funds to ensure elections can be carried out safely amid COVID-19. And the orders do nothing to keep our post offices open and make sure our elections are conducted in a safe and sound manner during this COVID crisis. The fact is, we are facing an unprecedented crisis. The government's going to have to commit resources to fight this disease and the economic devastation it has wrought. Executive orders cannot do that and therefore will always be sufficient, especially those crafted in such a poor way as these. The only way to crush the virus and truly protect American working families is to pass a comprehensive bill in Congress that is equal to the challenges facing our country. Democrats remain ready to return to the table. We need our Republicans to join us there and meet us halfway and work together to deliver immediate relief to the American people. We're ready as soon as our Republican colleagues have come off this view that it's their way or no way and meet us in the middle. Now, before I yield the floor, I want to take a step back and talk about the core problem in our negotiations over the past few weeks. President Trump and the Republican Party, certainly in the Senate, are not alive to the suffering of the American people. The response from the White House to the greatest domestic challenge of the 21st century can be summed up in 5 words, issued by President Trump in an interview last week. It is what it is. President Trump was challenged to defend his claim that COVID-19 is under control. How, he was asked. 1,000 Americans are dying a day. President Trump's response, it is what it is. It is what it is. That's how the President of the United States of America responds to the harrowing fact that more than 1,000 Americans are dying every single day from a virus his administration has failed to contain. Not a morsel of empathy, not an ounce of sorrow, not a shred of remorse for the many mistakes his administration has made. The President says It is what it is. What a shocking admission of presidential failure. We live in the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, and yet countries around the world manage to test their citizens, isolate cases, stop the spread of the disease. Countries with bigger populations than ours, and countries with a mere fraction of our resources and know-how. President Trump's response to this crisis is a national and an international embarrassment. The President says, it is what it is. President Trump is not the only one who dismisses the gravity of COVID-19. The lack of empathy and understanding starts at the top, but it goes all the way down. The President's Chief of Staff said COVID-19 isn't such a big deal for school children compared to the flu. Leader McConnell put the Senate on ice for 4 months in the middle of the global pandemic because his party, quote, didn't feel the urgency of acting. His words. And now, by the leader's own admission, more than a third of the Senate Republican caucus doesn't want to vote for anything to help the American people. The economy is failing. Small businesses are closing. State and local governments are cutting essential services. Americans can't pay the rent and will be thrown out of their homes. Families can't afford to feed their children. Essential workers don't have PPE. We're sending our kids back to school without a plan. The number of Americans we're testing is going down. The disease is ravaging our nursing homes. And Americans are dying. So many in so short a time that funeral homes and morgues are storing the dead in refrigerated 18-wheelers. And yet the President says, it is what it is. The President, his aides, his party in Congress are not even awake to what's happening in this country. That is the reason why Senate Republicans delayed for 4 long months. And that is the reason we've been unable to find agreement with the White House. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank the minority leader, the Democratic leader, Mr. Schumer, for his remarks. You know, there are not many of us around here in the Senate today. It's pretty quiet. You walk through the halls, virtually nobody around. That's what it was like last Thursday afternoon. That's what it was like here in the Senate on Friday, and again on Saturday, and again on Sunday. And here we are again on Monday, and this Senate is virtually a ghost town. A few people here, but for the most part, everybody was sent home by the majority leader, by Senator McConnell. He told senators, go home until further notice. Go home, we're going to put the Senate on standby. No need to be here doing the people's business. Well, Mr. President, the coronavirus is not on standby. The coronavirus is very much alive and well and spreading throughout the country, more severely in some parts than others, but spreading throughout the country, and with it has come the spread of economic pain and economic harm. So COVID-19 is not on standby, and neither is the economic pain and fallout that it's caused. But here in the United States Senate, the Republican leader, majority leader, has said, go home and be on standby. Mr. President, that is not leadership at any time. It is certainly not the kind of leadership that the American people need and should expect during a global pandemic and recession-era unemployment levels. So why did the majority leader tell people to just go home and be on standby? It's because he wanted the Trump administration to negotiate an agreement. Last I checked, Mr. President, the United States Senate was a separate branch of government with its own responsibilities. And yet we have the Republican leader who runs the United States Senate from the floor telling people to go home and be on standby because he wants the President of the United States, the Trump administration, to negotiate an agreement and then come back to us. In other words, the Republican leader wants to contract out his responsibilities and the responsibilities of the United States Senate to the executive branch. If you look at the United States Constitution, there are three separate branches of government, and yet the Republican leader has decided to give his proxy to the President of the United States, the executive branch, rather than stay here in the United States Senate and do our work. Now, why is that? Why is it that the majority leaders decided to contract out his responsibilities and that of the Senate to the executive branch of government? Well, we don't have to guess, because Mr. McConnell has told us. He told PBS NewsHour that, quote, about 20 of my members think that we've already done enough, end quote. Let me read that again. This is from the Republican leader. Quote, about 20 of my members think that we've already done enough, end quote. It's obviously referring to Republican members of the Senate caucus. These are members of the Senate Republican caucus. They think all is well. We've done enough. Don't need to do any more to expand access to testing. Don't need to expand access to personal protective equipment. Don't need to do anything to help our schools. We've done enough. Don't need to do anything more on unemployment insurance, where the additional $600 a week has expired. Senator McConnell said that 20 of his members thought they'd already done enough. Eviction moratorium coming to an end, both nationally and in many states. But 20 members of the Senate Republican caucus, their leader says, have done enough. Here's what Senator Lindsey Graham said on Fox, quote, I think if Mitch can get 1/2 of the conference, that'd be quite an accomplishment, end quote, referring to the Republican conference. So Senator Graham, South Carolina, is saying that if Mr. McConnell, if the Republican leader can get half the members of the Republican Senate caucus to do anything, that would be quite an accomplishment. I want all of us to think about what that means. What it means is that many of our colleagues are happy to have packed up and gone home, and that we're not doing anything because they don't think we need to be doing anything. And that, Mr. President, is really why we're not here. And that's also why you saw the Trump administration emissaries, Secretary Mnuchin and the Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, walk away from the negotiating table, because they understood that if they reached what was truly a compromise, a principled compromise, as Senator Graham said, half the Republican caucus would oppose it because they would oppose anything. So that's why you had the Trump administration walk away from the negotiating table and refuse to come to a sensible agreement. And what did we get instead? Because they walked away from an agreement, we had the President of the United States throw together a press conference at his golf club in New Jersey. Put the American flags up at his golf club, put out a podium, the presidential seal, invited club members to witness the signing of an executive order and some memos. And here's the really sad truth about the matter. It was mostly show rather than real substance. It was something that we would come to expect from somebody who was really good at reality TV, but somebody who did not understand the painful realities being experienced by Americans throughout this country during this health pandemic and the economic pandemic. And I say that because if you begin to look at what the president actually signed, it's both inadequate and also unworkable in almost all its parts. Now, let's put aside for now the question of whether or not the president had the legal authority to do what he did, because clearly, in some parts of his executive order and his memos, he does not have the constitutional authority to do that. We've heard that from some of the Senate Republican members already. But let's set that aside and just see whether it will actually deliver meaningful relief to Americans, or whether it's more like the degree that was given to folks who attended so-called Trump University, which turned out to be a fraud and is now shuttered. Let's take a look at what the president did. First, with respect to extending the $600 a week of unemployment insurance benefits. And let's remember the starting point for this is that neither the President of the United States, Donald Trump, nor the Republican Senate want to extend the $600 a week unemployment compensation. They say it's too much for Americans who are out of work through no fault of their own because of this pandemic. And even though there are 4 people looking for work right now in America for every job that's available, I hear from constituents every day. I read some of their stories last Thursday on the floor of the Senate. People who badly want to get back to work, but their former job is gone, and there's no new job to replace it. And they need that additional $600 a week to make ends meet. In fact, Mr. President, I want to just read to the Senate some additional letters I received from constituents on this point. Please act to extend the $600 a week unemployment enhancement. I am requesting both in my name and on behalf of my wife. We both lost our jobs, and the additional $600 is significantly helping keep us afloat and purchase the needs of life. My job was supposed to restart in late June, but the owner has pushed it back to November, December, to be determined. My wife was put on furlough and told the company hoped to bring everybody back, but has heard nothing yet. Without the additional $600, the time will come in the next few months when we will be unable to pay our bills. Here's a note I received from another constituent. Respectfully, Senator Chris Van Hollen, I would like to write to you about the $600 unemployment. I understand that the other party is fighting you all the way. This is painful because I'm a diabetic, and at this point, because that benefit was taken away, I have to choose between paying my bills or my insulin. I applied sometime in June since I was thinking I would be back to work. Gone are my savings paying rent, gone are my savings to pay rent, car loan insurance, and other bills. From this week on, because of losing the $600, I will have to stop paying bills so I can pay my insulin. I never thought that I would be in a situation like this in America, where if you work hard, pay your taxes, to be able to have a roof over your head, health insurance, and human dignity. And I, like I'm sure many of my colleagues, have received hundreds of notes like that from our constituents. People who will not be able to make ends meet without the additional $600 a week. But the president doesn't want to continue that, nor do Senate Republicans. And so what did the president say up in New Jersey? Well, he came up with this plan that unfortunately will not deliver. Essentially, what he said was, take the funds that were provided in the CARES Act to the states. The United States Congress provided about $150 billion to states to help during the early stages of this pandemic, both to help purchase things like PPE and also to address the economic fallout. I should remind my colleagues that Senator McConnell was dead against that, even in the earlier version. If you go back and look at the debate and the record, you'll find that he was dead set against providing any funds to state and local governments. That was the result of a compromise that we succeeded in pushing in those negotiations. But in these most recent negotiations, both the White House and again, Senator McConnell and Senate Republicans took the position, no funds for state and local government. I remember a few months back when asked, the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, said, let them go bankrupt. Let them go bankrupt. Well, there's a productive solution. He may have walked those comments back a little bit, but he did not walk back his opposition to any funds for state and local governments. So what did the president say in New Jersey the other day? Okay, states, take the earlier emergency funds that the Congress provided and use those as a 25% match to $300 federal dollars so that we can provide $400 per week in additional unemployment insurance. Here's the problem with that, Mr. President. We provided that $150 billion emergency assistance to the states because of the emergencies that they were facing then and continue to face. Because they're facing both increased costs with respect to helping frontline healthcare providers and hospitals and providing them with personal protective equipment. The federal government's been pretty much AWOL when it comes to testing. The president said to the states, you all set up testing regimes, and so they're using some of those funds we provided them for that. They're using those funds to try to open schools safely or help provide distance learning when schools can't be open safely. So many of the states, especially those hardest hit, have already allocated the great majority, if not all of those funds. And now the president's saying, oh, well, use those funds that we provided you earlier for this other purpose. So number one, those states and other areas have already allocated most of those funds. I noticed that if you look at the Treasury tables, the data they released, it was for the end of June, and it was already, money's already spent. Not today, money's already allocated. So first of all, for many states, that money's already spoken for. But let's say in some cases there's some money left over. What's the President of the United States saying? He's saying he wants to take from one American to give to another one. The president wants to pit these needs against one another. He wants to rob constituent Peter to pay constituent Paul. Those monies went to the states. Those monies went to states to pay for real needs. So, okay, governor, okay, state legislature, you're going to have to fire that emergency responder who will now both be out of a job and unable to provide emergency assistance so that you can give $100 match to help somebody who's lost their job a little bit more. That's what the president's saying to those states that do have something left over, and we don't even know how much that is. But if you think about it, that is not how a country should be responding in the middle of a pandemic. Governors, you got to hurt that person to help that one. That's what the President of the United States plan says. And that's when it's working the way he wants it. That's if it works as advertised. So from the president's perspective, best case scenario, when this plan's working, he's asking governors to take from one set of constituents and Americans who are hurting badly, could lose a job, they need the PPE, they need testing, they need to open the schools, but take it from over there and put it over here. That's what the president is saying. Now that's assuming it works at all, whether that money is available and whether or not there's a way you can actually do all this through what is a pretty cumbersome administrative process. I don't know if any of my colleagues saw either the Sunday shows in real time or reruns or read about them, but here's what Larry Kudlow was asked on the CNN morning show by Dana Bash. Simple question. Have you checked with the states how many of the 50 states and D.C. and other territories, and did they say they're going to be able to pony up the $100 a week per unemployed citizen? Larry Kudlow, answer. Good question. Good question. We'll probably find that out today or tomorrow as we make our canvass. Mr. President, if there wasn't another sign that what happened in New Jersey was a total show, this tells it all. They laid out a plan asking states that have run out of money, but if they have some money to rob Peter to pay Paul, but they didn't even ask the states if it was doable. They didn't even ask the states if it was doable. And that is a reflection of this entire plan. Let's look at what the president said about the second piece, payroll tax deferral. Now, a lot of Americans might have heard that and thought, I'm an employee, I'm working, and now the portion of my check that's withheld for payroll taxes like Social Security, I'm not going to have to pay that anymore, and that'll be money in my pocket. That's not what it did. What it did was say to these people who are working, and by the way, as we all know, deducting payroll taxes from paychecks doesn't help the 30 million who don't have a job. They're not getting a paycheck. They got nothing to deduct something from. But for people who are working and thought that this was going to be extra money that they could pocket forever, that's not the case. What the president was saying is that we will withhold those payroll taxes from your paychecks through the end of the year. But it's going to come due and owing. Now, these are people who are working. These are people who have their jobs. Maybe they want to defer that for a little while or not, but at the end of the day, they're going to have to pay it back to Uncle Sam. And here's the other problem. Employers are the ones who are legally responsible for the delivery of those payroll taxes, not just for the employer, but for the employee as well. And so they're going to have to take the risk that if one of their employees doesn't want their Social Security taxes paid, in other words, they want them withheld, that ultimately will be paid back. But what we're hearing from lots of employers is they can't guarantee that. First of all, what if that employee leaves? How am I going to repay that portion of the payroll taxes? And so here's another example of something that may have sounded good to some people when they heard it, but it really is a shell game in the first instance, and in many ways, a sham. And by the way, whether it's deferral or if it is ultimately forgiven, that would require an act of Congress, then it's the Social Security system that takes a hit, unless you refund it. But that's not in the president's plan. The president's memo doesn't talk about refunding it, if in fact it were ever forgiven, which he can't do either. Now, Mr. President, let's look at the eviction moratorium. I mean, that's a real mirage. I urge my colleagues just to read the executive order. The executive order tells Health and Human Services and the Centers for Disease Control to, quote, consider, unquote, whether an extended eviction moratorium is reasonably necessary to protect the public health. He's asking two federal agencies to consider a question he posed to them. Now, I imagine a lot of people who may have watched the president with the American flags up at his country club, imagine a lot of them thought, wow, the president just said that no one can get evicted. That's not what he said at all. It was a sham. He said HHS and CDC should consider whether an extended eviction moratorium is reasonably necessary to protect the public health. And then he asks HUD and Treasury to look around in their bank accounts to see if they have any money to help people who might be evicted. You know the way to help people who are evicted? First of all, don't let them be evicted in the first place, but to help them and the landlords, let's pass the rental assistance provision that's in the HEROES Act that passed the House. So, Mr. President, whether you look at the unemployment insurance provision or the payroll tax provision or the so-called eviction moratorium provision, this really is show and not substance. And I'm only talking about what the president put into the plan, not everything that got left out. Everything that got left out that is in the HEROES Act, helping people go back to school safely, helping expand real-time testing so that we can reopen our economy and schools safely, food assistance for those who are struggling, rental assistance, money for state and local government, whose needs have only risen dramatically since the last down payment that Congress passed in the CARES Act, and now the president's saying, we want you to go poach that fund and hurt people by taking things away from them in order to help other Americans. So those are some of the things that were totally left out of here. Now, I've often heard when talking about state and local government, the president, he tweets it all the time, that this is just a question of blue states wanting to be bailed out for bad economic decisions or bad budget problems they had, and that red states are just doing great. Mr. President, anybody who looks at the state financial affairs knows that's not true. Just take a look at my state of Maryland. Most people would consider us a blue state. We have a AAA bond rating. The last I checked, the state of Kentucky, it was a single A bond rating. So this isn't a question of whether we want to help states who somehow had difficult financial situations before the coronavirus hit. The reality is right now, this is not a red state or blue state issue. This is an American issue. We all know that the virus has spread throughout the country. Nobody can totally escape it. Doesn't matter whether you're a red state or a blue state. This is a red, white, and blue moment, and we need to treat it as a national effort. Not a state-by-state effort, but one also where the federal government plays a very important role and is not AWOL in the middle of a big pandemic and not playing politics in the middle of a pandemic. Listening to the healthcare experts about whether or not to wear a mask instead of making that a political statement that puts people at greater risk who follow the president's political advice rather than the healthcare advice of the healthcare experts. So, Mr. President, I hope we will get back to the negotiating table. But to do that, the president has got to be serious about reaching a conclusion, and he's going to need help from the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, and from that more than half the Senate Republican conference that both Senator McConnell and Senator Graham say don't want to do anything at all. Let me clarify that. The Republican leader said 20 members don't want to do anything at all, and it was Senator Graham who said about half. If that's the case, our country's in even bigger trouble than we might have thought, because there's a failure to recognize the immediacy of the need and the depth of the problem that we face. So let's get back to the negotiating table. I remember some of the president's top priorities when he first presented his plan. He wanted that tax break for 3 martini lunches for business executives. No to food assistance for needy families. Yes to tax breaks for 3 martini lunches. That's what the president said. I think we were also all surprised to see that he wanted $1.6 or $7 billion to build a new FBI headquarters at its current site, rather than follow through with the original plan, which was to move that headquarters to a suburban campus for security needs and to consolidate. But I guess if you rebuild it at its current site, then there's really no risk that someone will buy that land and end up building a hotel that competes with nearby Trump Hotel. That was part of the president's set of priorities in the middle of emergency. American people need to understand that. So let's get back to the negotiating table. What the president did was show and not substance. We need to work together in order to do something meaningful. So don't walk away. Come on back, and let's work. And just finally, Mr. President, when I say come on back, again, I'll end where I started. It's awfully quiet around here. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Virus isn't taking a vacation. Virus isn't taking any time off. The economic harm isn't taking a vacation or any time off. And yet here we are in the Senate, all quiet. Talks break down with the administration. We are a separate branch of government under the Constitution of the United States. Let's get back here and do our job for the American people. I yield the floor.